Have you ever felt the air grow colder, the room quieter, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching, a presence that you couldn't see but felt deep in your chest, sending chills down your spine? A faint knock echoes. Then, silence. Heavy breathing overlays the sound, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate. There are moments in life we can't explain. A door you swore was closed, now left ajar. A shadow shifting in the corner of your vision, vanishing the moment you turn. These moments stick with us, haunting our minds as we try to convince ourselves it's nothing, but sometimes it isn't. Tonight, you'll hear 5 true stories, accounts from people who were certain they were safe, only to discover that the safety they felt was an illusion. 5 stories that will keep you awake tonight, maybe even longer. Turn off the lights, settle in, and remember, what you're about to hear isn't fiction. These are true events, told by those who lived them and have never been the same since. Are you ready? On the surface, the Bennetts were your average suburban family. A young couple, Sarah and Mike, had just moved into a quaint 2-story home with their 6-year-old daughter, Ellie. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by friendly neighbors and tall, leafy trees. It seemed like the perfect place to settle down, but within days of moving in, Sarah began to notice things. Small things at first. The sound of faint footsteps when she was home alone. Objects she knew she had left in one place mysteriously moved. And then there was Ellie, who seemed oddly preoccupied with the basement. "Mommy," Ellie said one night at dinner, "the man in the basement says he doesn't like us here." Sarah and Mike laughed it off, dismissing it as a child's overactive imagination. But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't long before Sarah experienced it for herself. Late one night, as she sat reading in the living room, she heard a low, rhythmic creaking coming from below her feet, the basement. She froze, her eyes locked on the door that led downstairs. Mike, who had gone to bed early, couldn't have made the noise. Ellie was sound asleep in her room. So who, or what, was down there? The noises continued for weeks. Mike finally chalked it up to an old house settling, but Sarah wasn't so sure. Determined to prove to herself that it was nothing, she ventured down into the basement one evening, flashlight in hand. What she saw made her stomach turn. The air was damp, the walls lined with old wooden shelves cluttered with forgotten junk. As Sarah scanned the room, the beam of her flashlight landed on something unusual. A series of strange markings etched into the concrete floor. Symbols she didn't recognize. She tried to convince herself it was harmless, but when she turned to leave, she saw it. A dark figure standing at the foot of the stairs, just out of reach of the light, where she screamed. Mike came running, but by the time he got there, the figure was gone. The markings, however, remained. As the weeks turned into months, the activity in the house only grew worse. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights flickered at random. Sarah swore she could feel cold fingers brushing against her as she slept. And then, one night, Ellie disappeared. The police were called immediately. They searched the house from top to bottom, but Ellie was nowhere to be found. Then, Sarah remembered the basement. What they found down there would haunt the Bennetts forever. The basement was colder than usual that night. Sarah and Mike led the police down the narrow staircase, the faint sound of Ellie's cries echoing from somewhere deep within. The officers moved quickly, their flashlights scanning every corner. That's when one of them noticed something. A hidden door, half concealed by an old wooden cabinet. Suddenly the room plunged into darkness. Flashlights flickered, and the officers shouted in confusion. Sarah clung to Ellie as a deep, guttural sound filled the space. When the lights came back on, the markings on the floor began to glow faintly. The figure was there, watching, waiting. The Bennetts fled the house that night, leaving behind everything they owned. The events of that night remain unexplained, but Sarah swears the shadow still follows her to this day. This was only the beginning of their nightmare. But for some, basements aren't just storage spaces. Sometimes they're the gateway to something much darker. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies a stretch of wilderness untouched by time. Locals call it Blackwood Forest, a place of breathtaking beauty by day, but something else entirely by night. For decades, strange tales have surrounded the forest, whispered voices with no source, lights flickering deep between the trees, and the people who enter never to return. Despite the warnings, it's a popular destination for thrill seekers. People come from all over, eager to prove the stories wrong. That's exactly what four friends, Jake, Emily, Marcus, and Rachel, had in mind when they packed their gear and set off one chilly autumn morning. The hike started off like any other. The air was crisp, the leaves golden and red. Birds chirped overhead as they laughed and joked, following a poorly marked trail deeper into the forest. Marcus, the most skeptical of the group, couldn't help but tease the others. "I don't know what you guys are so scared of," he said. "It's just a bunch of trees." But as they ventured further in, the atmosphere began to change. The sunlight, once bright and warm, grew dim as the canopy thickened. The air turned colder, the cheerful sounds of wildlife fading into an unsettling silence. It was Rachel who first noticed something odd. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others stopped, listening. At first there was nothing, but then, faint and distant, came the sound of whispers. Like 100 voices speaking at once, too quiet to make out any words. "Probably the wind," Marcus said, but his laugh lacked its usual confidence. Emily suggested they turn back, but Jake, ever the adventurer, insisted they keep going. "We've come this far," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" By late afternoon, the group was completely lost. The trail markers they'd followed so carefully seemed to have vanished. The map was no help, and their phones had no signal. Worse, the whispers had grown louder, now coming from every direction. They stopped to rest by a stream, but even the water seemed wrong. Its surface perfectly still, as though the current had been frozen in place. It was then that Emily noticed the trees. Every trunk was carved with strange, jagged symbols, unlike anything she'd ever seen. "Do you think this is some kind of prank?" she asked, but no one answered. They were too busy staring at the forest around them, where the shadows had begun to shift and move. When night fell, the situation went from unsettling to terrifying. Without a fire, they huddled together in the dark, the whispers now so loud they could barely hear each other. Rachel swore she saw someone, or something, moving between the trees, but the others dismissed it as her imagination. That's when they heard it. A low, guttural sound, unlike any animal they'd ever heard. Marcus stood, flashlight in hand, determined to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. He barely took 3 steps before the light flickered and died, leaving them in total darkness. They called out for him, but there was no answer. Then came the scream, a blood-curdling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When they ran toward the sound, all they found was Marcus's flashlight, lying shattered on the ground. Panic set in. The remaining 3 stumbled through the forest, desperate to find their way out. But no matter which direction they turned, they ended up back at the stream. The whispers were louder than ever, now sounding like laughter. And then they saw it. Standing on the opposite side of the water was a figure cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the sense of dread it radiated was overwhelming. Jake tried to confront it, shouting into the darkness, but the figure only tilted its head, as though amused. Where they turned to run, Emily tripped, landing hard on the ground. Rachel tried to help her, but something grabbed her wrist, a hand, cold and bony, emerging from the dirt. She screamed, pulling free, but when she turned, Emily was gone. By morning, only Jake and Rachel made it out of the forest. They were found by a search party, wandering the edge of the woods in a daze. Of Marcus and Emily, there was no sign. The symbols on the trees had vanished, and the whispers were gone. To this day, Rachel refuses to speak about what happened that night. Jake, however, has one thing to say. If you hear whispers in the forest, turn back. No matter how curious you are, don't go looking for where they lead. The Harper family had always prided themselves on their love for antiques. Their home was a carefully curated collection of vintage furniture, old photographs and heirlooms passed down through generations. So, when Sarah Harper's sister gifted her an ornate porcelain doll she found at an estate sale, Sarah didn't think twice about placing it in the living room cabinet alongside their other treasures. The doll was beautiful, delicately painted features, piercing blue eyes, and a white lace dress. But there was something about it, something no one could quite place. Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, Lily, seemed especially uneasy around it. "I don't like her," Lily said one evening, pointing to the doll. "She looks at me." At first, Sarah dismissed her daughter's comments. After all, Lily had an overactive imagination. But as the weeks went by, strange things began to happen. Small things. The doll, which was always carefully positioned in the cabinet, would sometimes appear in different poses, its head tilted at a new angle, or its hand raised as if waving. The Harpers laughed it off as forgetfulness, or perhaps Lily playing tricks. But soon they couldn't ignore the signs. Cool night. As Sarah was locking up the house, she noticed the cabinet door was ajar. The doll sat on the edge of the shelf, its head turned toward the front door as if watching her. She put it back in place, muttering to herself about her clumsy hands. But when she turned off the lights and went upstairs, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor. The disturbances escalated. Sarah began finding the doll in places it didn't belong. On the kitchen counter, the stairs, even in Lily's room. "I didn't touch it," Lily insisted, tears streaming down her face. At first, Sarah didn't believe her. But one night, she witnessed something she couldn't explain. It was just after midnight when Sarah heard a soft thud coming from downstairs. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept into the living room, her heart pounding. The cabinet door was wide open, and the doll was sitting on the coffee table, its glassy eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she thought she saw its lips twitch, as if it was trying to smile. Desperate for answers, Sarah called her sister to ask about the doll's origins. What she learned only deepened her unease. The estate sale had been held for an elderly woman who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. According to rumors, the woman had been a recluse obsessed with collecting dolls. This particular doll was said to be her favorite, the one she spoke to late at night. The Harpers tried to ignore the doll, hoping it was all in their heads. But the events grew more sinister. Lily woke up screaming one night, claiming the doll had been standing at the foot of her bed. "She said my name," Lily cried. "She said she wanted to play." By now, even Sarah's husband, David, was on edge. One evening, he attempted to throw the doll into the trash, but by morning it was back in the cabinet, its dress miraculously spotless, despite the rain the night before. David swore he hadn't put it there, and neither had anyone else. The final straw came on a cold November night. Sarah awoke to the sound of Lily's voice, speaking softly in her room. At first, she thought Lily was having a nightmare, but as she approached the door, she heard another voice. Soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably inhuman. It was coming from the doll. Bursting into the room, Sarah found Lily sitting cross-legged on the floor, the doll in her lap. "She says she doesn't like you," Lily murmured, her voice distant as though in a trance. Sarah snatched the doll away, but the room suddenly filled with an icy chill. The lights flickered, and the air seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Then, with a deafening crash, the mirror on Lily's wall shattered. At night, the Harpers fled the house, leaving everything behind, including the doll. Months later, the new homeowners found it tucked away in the attic, its dress still pristine, its eyes still watching. They claimed they heard faint whispers when the house was quiet, but no one believed them. Until the accidents began. To this day, the doll remains in that house, waiting for its next family. Some say it's just an old toy, a harmless relic of the past, but others believe it's something more, something that feeds on fear, on chaos, on lives it can destroy. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. If you ever come across a doll like this, leave it where you found it. Some gifts aren't meant to be kept, because once you invite it in, it might never leave. James Calloway wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. As a traveling salesman, he'd spent countless nights in budget motels and roadside inns, often brushing off the creaks and groans of old buildings as nothing more than the sounds of aging wood and faulty plumbing. But the night he checked into room 217 at the Hollow Creek Inn would change everything he thought he knew about the world. Hollow Creek Inn was a weathered two-story hotel tucked away off a forgotten highway. James was on his way to a business meeting when a storm forced him to pull off the road. The rain lashed against his windshield as he spotted the neon vacancy sign flickering in the distance. The building itself seemed to sag under the weight of years, its paint peeling and windows streaked with grime. It wasn't his first choice, but it was late, and he was desperate for a dry bed. The woman at the front desk didn't seem surprised to see him. "Room 217, she said, sliding a tarnished key across the counter. Her eyes lingered on him for just a moment too long, and her voice dropped as she added, "Don't mind the noises, it's an old place." James gave her a polite smile, thinking nothing of it, and made his way to his room. The room was small and sparsely furnished. Just a bed, a chair, and a rickety nightstand with a lamp that flickered faintly when he turned it on. The wallpaper was faded, curling at the edges, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Still, it was a place to rest, and James was too tired to care. Or so he thought. The first knock came just after midnight. It was soft but deliberate, coming from somewhere near the door. James sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, but there was no answer. He opened the door to find an empty hallway, the flickering light above casting long, eerie shadows. Shrugging it off, he locked the door and went back to bed. But as he lay there staring at the ceiling, he felt it, a cold draft that seemed to seep through the room, chilling him to the bone. The heater was on, but it made no difference. And then, just as he was about to drift off, he heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the corner of the room. James bolted upright, his eyes scanning the room. The corner was shrouded in shadow, but nothing seemed out of place. Telling himself it was his imagination, he turned on the bedside lamp and tried to relax. But then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The chair by the window was no longer empty. A faint impression, as if someone had just been sitting there, had formed in the faded fabric of the cushion. James felt his chest tighten. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe the fabric had shifted when he moved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, each one too quiet to make out, yet unmistakably human. And then came the movement. The lamp flickered, and the chair seemed to rock ever so slightly, as if nudged by an invisible hand. By now, James was wide awake, his heart pounding in his ears. He grabbed his phone to call the front desk, but the line was dead. Frustrated and unnerved, he decided to confront whatever was happening. "Enough of this," he muttered, throwing open the closet door in a burst of defiance. It was empty, of course, but as he turned to leave, he saw something in the mirror. A figure standing behind him, just out of reach. James stumbled back, his breathing ragged. When he turned around, the room was empty. but the whispers had stopped. For a moment he thought it was over, but then the bed began to shake. The bed rattled violently, as though something was trying to pull it apart. James scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around the room. The air grew heavier, colder, and the faint outline of a figure began to form in the shadows. It wasn't solid, more like a haze, shifting and swirling, but its presence was undeniable. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and relentless. "Leave," they seemed to say. "Leave." James didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing his bag, he bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock twisted and turned on its own, as though resisting him. Just as he thought he was trapped, the door flew open, and James stumbled into the hallway. The air outside was eerily still, the flickering lights above casting strange shadows. He didn't look back as he ran to his car, the whispers following him all the way to the parking lot. James never returned to the Hollow Creek Inn, but he couldn't forget what he saw that night. When he told his story to friends, most of them laughed it off, but one person, a local, pulled him aside and said, "You stayed in room 217. You're lucky you got out, not everyone does." To this day, room 217 remains empty, its door permanently locked. Staff claim they hear knocking coming from inside, even though no one has been in there for years. And every so often, when the hallway is quiet, they swear they hear whispers, as if the room is still waiting for its next guest. For Megan Carter, a second-year art student at Green Ridge University, vintage shops and flea markets were a treasure trove of inspiration. She loved collecting odd, forgotten items to use as references for her sketches and paintings. It was on one of these weekend trips that she found it, the mirror. It wasn't particularly large nor ornate, but there was something about it that caught Megan's eye. The frame was made of dark, carved wood, with intricate patterns that seemed almost alive in their detail. The glass itself was slightly warped, giving it an unsettling quality. When she asked the vendor about it, he hesitated before saying, "It's old. Been passed down a lot. Not everyone keeps it for long." Megan shrugged off his vague comment, buying the mirror for just $20. She carried it back to her dorm, thinking it would add a touch of character to her otherwise plain room. She hung it on the wall above her desk and thought little of it, until that night. As Megan sat sketching at her desk, she noticed something strange in the mirror. At first, it was subtle, a shadowy flicker in the corner of her eye. She assumed it was a trick of the light, a reflection from her laptop screen. But as the night wore on, it became harder to ignore. When she finally looked directly at the mirror, she saw her own reflection, staring back. But something was off. Her reflection was slower, slightly delayed, as if it were hesitating before copying her movements. Megan waved her hand experimentally, and though the reflection followed, there was a lag, a fraction of a second too long. She told herself it was the warped glass, an optical illusion. But deep down, she felt something wasn't right. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Megan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The mirror seemed to draw her attention at odd times, almost as if it was calling to her. And then, one night, she saw her. It was around 2 a.m. when Megan woke with a start. The room was dark except for the faint glow of her desk lamp, which she'd forgotten to turn off. Groggy and confused, she glanced at the mirror and froze. Standing in the reflection just behind her was a woman. She was pale, with long, dark hair that hung in damp, stringy locks over her face. Her eyes were sunken, staring directly at Megan. Megan spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she looked back at the mirror. The woman was still there, now closer, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Megan stumbled back, knocking over her chair. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then the woman smiled. A cold, empty expression that sent shivers down Megan's spine. From that night on, Megan avoided the mirror as much as possible. But it didn't seem to matter. The woman's presence began to creep into other aspects of her life. Megan saw her reflection in windows, in puddles, even in the darkened screen of her phone. Always watching, always waiting toward the evening. Megan decided she'd had enough. She covered the mirror with a bedsheet, hoping to block it out entirely. But when she woke the next morning, the sheet was gone, crumpled in a pile on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, and the woman in the reflection was closer than ever. Her hand pressed against the glass as though she was trying to break through. Desperate, Megan researched the mirror's origins. She tracked down the flea market vendor who admitted he didn't know much about it, only that it had been sold and returned countless times. "They say it belonged to a woman who died in front of it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was obsessed with her reflection. Some people think her spirit is still trapped inside." At night, Megan decided to get rid of the mirror. She carried it out to the campus dumpster, her hands trembling the entire way. But just as she was about to throw it in, the glass caught her reflection. She froze. The woman in the mirror was no longer distant. She was standing directly behind Megan, her hand reaching out, her expression twisted in anger. Megan could only stare at her fingers for a moment, her hand reaching out, her expression twisted in anger. In her panic, Megan dropped the mirror and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. But instead of relief, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The fragments scattered across the pavement, each one reflecting the woman's face, watching her from every angle. Megan screamed and ran, leaving the broken pieces behind. The next day, Megan thought it was over. The mirror was gone and the strange occurrences stopped. But as she walked to class, she glanced at a store window, and there she was, the woman, standing in the reflection, closer than ever. To this day, Megan avoids mirrors as much as possible, but sometimes when she catches her reflection in passing, she swears she sees the faint outline of someone else, a shadow, a smile. A reminder that some things, once invited in, can never truly leave. The next time you look into a mirror, take a closer look. Are you sure the reflection you see is your own? Or is it someone or something else staring back at you? It was supposed to be the fresh start they had been waiting for. The family of 4 had found the perfect home. Nestled in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids played in the streets and neighbors waved hello from their front porches. To anyone who looked, it seemed like just another charming house, a peaceful slice of life. You could hear the soft hum of the wind through the trees as they unloaded boxes into the front door. The house was clean, freshly painted, with a warm feeling that made it immediately welcoming. The family stood there, admiring the house, smiling at each other, excited for what lay ahead. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something began to change. The house, once seemingly full of promise, seemed to grow quieter, almost too quiet. The wind stopped blowing, and the usual sounds of the neighborhood seemed to fade, as though the house itself was holding its breath. In the stillness, there was a creak. And another. The faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the house. It wasn't until later that evening that they started to notice the oddities. Nothing overt at first. Small things. A door left slightly ajar that they were certain had been closed. A light flickering in the hallway for just a moment longer than it should have. At first, they brushed it off. Everyone was tired after the move, but as the days passed, the strange occurrences grew harder to ignore. The youngest child, Sarah, began to hear things at night. Whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from the dark corners of her room. She told her parents about the voices, but they didn't think much of it. Kids have vivid imaginations, they reassured each other. But there was something about the way Sarah spoke about the sounds that made them uneasy, as though she wasn't just imagining it. Her older brother Matt started hearing them too. But it wasn't just voices anymore. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps pacing up and down the hallway outside their rooms. At night, they would both lie awake in the dark, waiting for the sounds to stop. But they never did. It was the night they couldn't explain away. The house felt colder than usual, the air thick and still, as though time itself had stopped moving. Sarah had been up late watching TV in the living room when she heard it again. The sound of someone walking upstairs. She called out, thinking it was her parents. No answer. She called again, her voice louder this time. Still nothing. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way to the staircase, the dim light from the living room casting long shadows across the walls. The house creaked as if settling under its own weight. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. As she stood there at the foot of the stairs, Sarah felt a sudden cold rush over her, like a draft moving through the house. She glanced up, expecting to see her father's figure descending from the top of the stairs. But no one was there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, but from nowhere she could see. Every so often the sound would stop, only to begin again in a different direction. When Sarah told her parents, they told her it was probably the house settling, nothing more. But even they couldn't deny the feeling that had settled in the pit of their stomachs. The oddities continued. Objects started appearing in places they hadn't been left. A kitchen knife on the counter where it shouldn't have been. A chair pulled out from the dining table as if someone had been sitting there. They began checking every door, every window, but nothing ever seemed to be out of place. One afternoon, while Sarah was playing in the backyard, she found something odd. Something wedged in the gap between the back fence and the old shed. A small, unmarked box, weathered by time, with a heavy, strange feeling that seemed to emanate from it. Curious, she opened. Inside was a small, faded photograph. A black and white image of a family standing outside a house. The house looked almost identical to theirs. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the picture. The people in the photo had no faces. Later that night, the family sat around the dinner table discussing their unsettling discoveries. The photograph was placed in the center of the table, the image of the faceless figures staring up at them. But as the family talked, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. As if it was trying to tell them something they couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until the third night that the true nature of the house began to reveal itself. The house had always been eerily quiet at night, but that night was different. There was a low, persistent sound, a hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Matt woke up to it first. The vibration was so strong it rattled his teeth, and his bed seemed to tremble beneath him. He sat up, eyes wide in the dark, listening to the strange hum that filled the room. Then it stopped, abruptly, as though something had cut it off mid-sentence. But what happened next made his blood run cold. From down the hall, he heard a door creak open, followed by the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching his room. But there was no one there. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now. Something was in the house with them. Matt stood frozen in his bed, staring into the darkness. Just as the door creaked open, the footsteps stopped. He wasn't alone, and whatever it was waiting for them to notice. It was an old house, the kind of house that had a story, a history you couldn't quite put your finger on. A family of 4 had moved in, hoping for a fresh start, an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house was beautiful on the outside, a large Victorian home with intricate woodwork and sprawling lawns, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to swallow the road leading up to it. But there was something about it, something that felt off. The first night they spent there, the temperature in the house dropped inexplicably. It was summer, yet the chill in the air was unmistakable. creeping into every corner, every room, every crevice. The walls groaned as if they were sighing under the weight of their own age, and at times it felt like the house was breathing, slow, deep, and heavy, like a living creature exhaling softly in the dark. As they unpacked, the family tried to shake off the odd sense of unease. It was an old house, after all. Old houses creaked, old houses groaned. But the deeper they settled in, the more they began to realize there was something else here. Something watching. In the dead of night, you could hear it. A faint whisper in the walls. A soft murmur like a conversation taking place just out of reach. At first, they tried to ignore it. Old houses made noises, didn't they? But when the creaking of the floorboards became rhythmic, almost deliberate, they began to wonder, what was really living in these walls? The odd occurrences started small, just little things that might be brushed off as imagination or coincidence. But soon they couldn't be ignored. The youngest child, Timmy, began hearing voices late at night. At first, it seemed like an innocent game, imaginary friends maybe. But when he started speaking to someone who wasn't there, a sense of dread settled over the family. "Who are you talking to, Timmy?" his mother asked one evening, her voice soft with concern as she stood at the doorway of his room. Timmy's reply sent a shiver down her spine. "The man in the corner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't want us to leave." They laughed it off, trying to ease the tension, but that night, the mother swore she heard Timmy's voice again. But this time, it wasn't him. It was a deeper, raspier voice, as if someone else were in the room with him. Her heart raced. When she opened the door, the room was empty, save for Timmy sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. Things grew stranger as the days went on. In the bathroom, mirrors began to show reflections that didn't match the reality of the room. Timmy's face, distorted, would appear for a split second, then vanish. Shadows flickered behind the glass, like figures that were only half there. But the strange occurrences weren't limited to the mirrors. The shadows in the corners of the rooms began to move, stretching unnaturally, twisting in the edges of your vision. Something was lurking in the dark corners of the house, something that didn't want to be seen, but was always there, just out of sight. And then the lights started flickering. The soft hum of electricity in the walls became erratic, flickering, dimming, buzzing with an intensity that rattled the nerves. One night, the lights went out entirely, plunging the family into a suffocating darkness. They couldn't explain it. Nothing in the house made sense anymore. It felt like the walls were closing in, and every deep breath you took felt wrong, like the house was breathing with you. It didn't take long for the family to realize the house was changing. At first, it was the small things. A door that had always been there now seemed to vanish, replaced by a new one, an unfamiliar hallway. The house was shifting, rearranging itself in ways they couldn't understand. Rooms seemed to appear out of nowhere. Doorways led to places they had never seen before. Once, the father ventured down what should have been the kitchen corridor, only to find himself at the top of a staircase that wasn't supposed to exist. "We need to get out of here," the mother said one night, her voice trembling. They packed what they could, determined to leave before things got worse. But the moment they tried to leave, something stopped them, an unseen force that gripped the air like a vice. The door wouldn't open, no matter how hard they pulled. The walls groaned louder now, the house protesting, almost as if it didn't want them to leave. The air became thick, suffocating. It was like the house had a will of its own, a hunger that was starting to consume them. Every time they tried to escape, the house shifted again. The hallway they walked down would suddenly lengthen, the door they thought was in front of them disappearing into the distance. They were trapped. The house had claimed them. In a final, desperate attempt, they made a run for it. The family sprinted through the winding hallways, but the house had no intention of letting them go. Doors slammed shut in their faces. The walls seemed to pulse, throb, as if the house itself was alive. They were running in circles, unable to escape, only to end up in the same room over and over again. Despair began to set in. The temperature dropped sharply, the air growing colder with every step they took. Suddenly, the lights flickered one last time, and then it happened. The walls seemed to collapse inward, and for a brief moment, the house revealed its true form. The walls were not just wood and plaster, they were living, breathing things, veins running along the surfaces, pulsing with a dark, unnatural energy. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the house, as though something immense, ancient and hungry, was awakening from its slumber. From the corners of their vision, distorted faces began to appear, pressing against the walls. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, silent, screaming, twisted. It was the house itself. The house that had fed off fear for generations, drawing its strength from the terror it instilled in its inhabitants. The house wasn't haunted, it was the haunting. The father screamed as a heavy weight pressed down on him, and the mother pulled at the door, trying in vain to break free. But there was no escape. The house had them now, and it wasn't going to let them leave. In that final, desperate moment, as they were swallowed by the shifting, groaning walls, they realized one horrifying truth. The house wasn't just alive, it was feeding on them. It had always been alive, and it would never let them go. It was an old house, a house filled with the scent of memories, dust, and time. Emma had inherited it from her grandmother, a sprawling, weathered estate tucked away at the end of a long dirt road. The house had always felt like it had a life of its own. It creaked and groaned, as if the walls remembered things, stories buried beneath years of silence. The heavy wooden doors and winding staircase, faded wallpaper peeling from age. It was as if time had forgotten this place. She didn't mind. She needed the change, a fresh start. Emma moved in alone, leaving behind the noise of the city to breathe in the stillness of the house. The attic, untouched for decades, was the first place she explored. As she climbed the old stairs, the air grew colder with each step, the faint scent of mothballs and wood filling her nose. When Emma opened the attic door, a cloud of dust hung in the air. Dim sunlight filtered through small, cracked windows, casting long shadows across the room. The silence here was thick, almost oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock from an old mantelpiece in the corner. Everything was covered in sheets, as though the house had been frozen in time. And then she saw it. A large, ornate mirror tucked away in the corner, covered by a dusty sheet. It looked ancient, out of place among the other forgotten relics of the attic. The frame was intricately carved, depicting swirling patterns and figures she couldn't quite make out. It stood there, almost waiting, as if it had been expecting her. As she pulled the sheet away, a cold chill ran down her spine. There was something wrong about the mirror, something unnerving about the way the glass seemed to shimmer, even though no light touched it directly. The ticking of the clock grew louder, as though it were counting down to something. A faint whisper echoed in the room, soft and barely audible, just on the edge of hearing. Over the next few days, Emma couldn't shake the pull of the mirror. It was like it was calling to her, drawing her attention no matter where she went in the house. She'd catch glimpses of herself in the reflection as she moved past, but there was something odd about the way the reflection behaved. Her movements were slightly delayed, as though the mirror was always a beat behind her. But sometimes, when she looked closer, it wasn't just a reflection. Something seemed off. Her face in the mirror would distort like a ripple passing through water. She started spending more time in front of it, watching her own reflection, expecting it to behave like it always had, just her, just a reflection. But over time, the changes grew harder to ignore. The clock's ticking in the background was growing more insistent, louder with each passing day, and the whispers seemed to be coming from within the mirror itself. not from the room. One night, as she sat on the floor staring into the glass, Emma could swear that she saw something move in the reflection. Not just her, something else. A shadow flickered in the corner of the mirror, just beyond her own image. She blinked and it was gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. Something was not right. The air felt heavier in front of the mirror, like it was thick with some kind of presence. Something that didn't belong. Her obsession with the mirror deepened. She couldn't look away. Even when she wasn't in front of it, she could feel it calling her. The house, which had once felt so quiet, now felt alive with the sound of whispers, the creaking of floorboards in places she couldn't see. But it was the mirror that held her, its grip tightening around her thoughts, pulling her deeper into something darker. It was one night, as the clock ticked past midnight, that the reflection began to change in ways that Emma couldn't ignore. She was sitting on the floor again, eyes locked on the mirror. She watched as her reflection stared back at her. At first, just the same as always, but then it moved. Not in sync with her. The reflection smiled at her. She gasped, trying to step away from the glass, but her body refused to move. The reflection was alive. The woman in the mirror, her reflection, reached out with a hand that wasn't hers, its fingers stretching toward Emma. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a trap, a vessel to something else. Something darker. It had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to step into its grasp. Emma's reflection stepped forward from the glass, its eyes burning with an unnatural light, its features twisted in a way that didn't make sense. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was rooted to the spot, her own reflection now staring at her from the inside of the mirror, its grin widening, as if it had already won. The mirror had been cursed. Her grandmother had warned her once, a long time ago. It had the power to trap souls, trapping them in the glass, feeding on their essence, using them to replace the one who stood before it. Emma's breath quickened, panic clawing at her chest as her reflection began to move independently, stepping out of the mirror, its hand reaching for her with terrifying speed. It was no longer a reflection. It was something else, something that wasn't her. But it was going to take her place. Her own body now felt like a foreign. The reflection's smile widened one final time, its eyes locking onto hers with a twisted satisfaction. Emma screamed, but the sound was muffled, trapped inside her own throat. And then, without warning, the reflection lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her into the glass. Everything went cold, the room spinning as she was yanked forward, her body unable to fight the pull. And then, suddenly, the mirror stood still once more, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The ticking clock had stopped. The whispers faded away. The house was quiet. No more movements, no more shadows, nothing but the cold, oppressive silence. Then, faintly, as if from within the glass, Emma's voice echoed softly, "Pout." But when anyone looked into the mirror again, there was only her reflection, smiling, standing still in the glass, her eyes cold and empty. And Emma was gone. The mirror had claimed her, and now it was waiting for the next person foolish enough to look too long. It was an old, decaying house, tucked away at the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and the land stretched out like a forgotten piece of the world. The house had stood there for decades, some said centuries, and no one dared go near it after dark. The windows of the house were like hollow eyes, black and empty, staring out into the ever-encroaching darkness of the woods beyond. It wasn't just abandoned, it was avoided. Locals whispered about the house, but the stories were always vague, lost in time, tangled with myth. All anyone knew for sure was that no one who had ever entered the house had returned unchanged, and those who did come back didn't talk about what they saw. At least, not for long. Jessica was the kind of teenager who didn't believe in legends. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories or abandoned places. To her, the thrill of exploring the forbidden, the uncharted, was irresistible, and when she heard the rumors about the old house, about how it had been abandoned for over 50 years, how people swore they'd seen lights flickering in the windows at night, she knew she had to see it for herself. Chilly evening, with the sun sinking low in the sky, she grabbed her flashlight, zipped up her jacket, and set out. The house wasn't far from the town, but the walk through the woods seemed longer than she remembered, as if the trees themselves were closing in around her. She finally arrived, standing before it, its silhouette casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. But for Jessica, it was a challenge, an adventure. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the house wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. And the moment she stepped over the threshold, she was no longer just an explorer. She was now part of its story. At first, everything seemed just as she expected. The house was dark, dusty, and silent. The air inside was thick, stagnant, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Jessica moved carefully through the rooms, her flashlight illuminating broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs clinging to the corners. It was as if time itself had decided to stop here, leaving everything to decay. She explored the downstairs first, checking every corner, every room, making mental notes of the house's layout. The place felt empty, lifeless, and yet there was something about it. Something off. But she shrugged it off as just her imagination running wild. That was until she found the mirror. It was in a small, dimly lit hallway upstairs. The mirror stood against the wall, framed in tarnished gold, cracked in several places. It had a strange, unsettling feel to it, like it wasn't supposed to be there. Jessica hesitated for a moment, then approached it. As her reflection appeared in the cracked surface, she instinctively straightened her hair. And that's when it happened. Her reflection didn't move with her. For a split second, it stayed perfectly still, as if it was frozen in time. But then, after that brief moment, it jerked, like it was trying to catch up with her movements. Jessica blinked, her heart racing. She quickly stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was nothing, she told herself. A trick of the light, a shadow in the corner of her eye. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just... The house was still. Too still. It was like time had stopped. And then, just as Jessica turned away from the mirror, she heard it, a soft creak from somewhere deep within the house. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Someone was moving, but she was alone. Her flashlight shook slightly in her hand, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. She called out, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But no answer came. She was the only one in the house. Or at least, that's what she thought. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. But every time Jessica turned to face them, they stopped. And then, just as suddenly, they would start again, further down the hall, just out of sight. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed forward, driven by the need to prove herself, to prove that there was nothing to fear in this place. But something was wrong. Something was watching her, and she felt it. The air grew colder, denser, like the house was closing in around her. Then, just as she rounded the corner to the next room, the sound of faint whispers filled the air. Low and indistinct, like a conversation in another room. She froze, listening, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers seemed to circle her, too quiet to understand, but close, so close, like they were right behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Jessica's flashlight flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the hallway. She spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the hallway was empty. No one was there, yet the whispers continued, clearer now, more distinct. just out of reach. She was about to turn back when a loud bang, came from somewhere deep in the house, followed by a series of heavy footsteps. Her heart skipped. Someone was coming, but when she looked down the hallway, there was no one in sight. No footsteps, no voices, just silence, and the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned back to the mirror, the one that had started it all. The reflection staring back at her was wrong. Her own face was twisted, contorted, a version of herself, but not quite right. Her lips stretched into a grin, wide and unblinking, and then, in that split second, the reflection smiled back at her. A cold, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. The mirror, the reflection, wasn't just an illusion. It was a warning. Something was coming, something already here. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that Jessica heard it. A voice, soft at first, so soft it could have been a whisper on the wind. Jessica. It wasn't her voice. It was a voice that came from somewhere far deeper, from somewhere else. And when she turned to look, her eyes locked with the reflection again, and that's when she saw it, right behind her. In the mirror, someone was standing in the dark hallway, watching her. But when she turned around, the hallway was empty, and the whisper came again, this time louder, almost a growl. Jessica, you shouldn't have come here. Deep in the mountains, hidden away from the hustle and bustle of the world, there was a small secluded cabin. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the previous owner had vanished without a trace. People in the nearby town talked about it, though the stories were always vague and filled with whispers. Rumors about bloodstains found leading into the woods, and eerie sounds that came from the cabin at night. No one had ever dared to venture too close. The area had become a place for ghost stories, a haunted memory of a man who disappeared in the dead of night, leaving only a trail of blood and fear. The woods around the cabin seemed to grow darker with every passing year, and the silence, when you were near it, felt suffocating, unnatural. David, however, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. A skeptic at heart, he thought the rumors were just that, stories. He had heard all the talk from the locals, but he refused to let them sway him. He was determined to spend the weekend alone in that cabin. He didn't believe in curses or supernatural forces. He believed in logic and reason. So when he found himself driving up the winding mountain road towards the cabin, he felt nothing but the thrill of proving everyone wrong. The cabin was exactly as the rumors described. Old, weathered, and surrounded by a thick blanket of trees that seemed to whisper with the wind. But there was no fear in David's heart. There was only curiosity. He stepped out of his car, grabbed his bag, and made his way inside, convinced that the only thing he would find in the cabin was dust and memories of a past long forgotten. But as soon as he stepped over the threshold, something in the air changed. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving him in an unnatural silence. The trees, tall and ancient, stood like silent sentinels, their branches hanging low, almost as though they were watching him. The air felt too still, too heavy, as if the very atmosphere in the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. David brushed it off as just his imagination. After all, the place had been abandoned for so long. But something nagged at the back of his mind. An unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. The moment he closed the door behind him, it felt as though he had sealed himself off from the world. As if the forest outside wasn't just around him, it was closing in. David settled into the cabin, trying to shake the feeling of unease that clung to him. He lit the fireplace, made himself a drink, and turned on his phone, hoping to distract himself from the growing discomfort. The night outside grew darker, and the wind howled in the distance, but inside the cabin, all was quiet. It seemed like any other night in a forgotten place. As the clock ticked past 3 a.m., David's eyes began to feel heavy, the fatigue of the drive finally catching up with him. That was when it happened. A loud bang that echoed through the cabin, coming from upstairs. The sound was sharp, sudden, and loud enough to make the walls rattle. David shot up from the chair, his heart racing. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to process the noise. Was it the wind? A loose board? But no, this sound was too deliberate, too forceful. There was something, or someone, upstairs. His pulse pounding in his ears, David slowly made his way upstairs. The air was colder now, and the cabin seemed even quieter than before. He reached the top of the stairs and froze, staring down the narrow hall at the door at the far end. The door that had never been there before. It was heavy, rusted, and seemed completely out of place. There was something strange about it. The wood was old, like it had been in the house for centuries, and yet it looked completely undisturbed. The door was sealed tight, covered with strange symbols etched into its surface, symbols that David didn't recognize, though they gave him a distinct sense of dread. He approached it cautiously, his hand hovering above the handle. As soon as he touched the door, a chill ran through his body, colder than the night air outside. The hairs on his arms stood on end. The room felt thick, as though something had filled the space with a presence too heavy to ignore. And then there was the smell, a faint but unmistakable stench of decay. David recoiled for a moment, his breathing shallow. This couldn't be real, he thought. This had to be some sort of prank or a trick of the house's age. But something told him that wasn't the case. A deep breath, David grabbed the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small room frozen in time. It was as if nothing had been touched for decades, except for the walls. They were covered in more of those strange symbols, drawn hastily in red, as though someone had been in a panic to mark them. The floor was littered with dried blood, clinging to the wood in dark, thick patches. It smelled even worse in here, and David's stomach turned, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the room. As he stepped inside, he noticed something else. Old, weathered furniture in the corner, toppled as if someone had left in a hurry. Papers scattered across the floor. But it was the old, tattered journal on the desk that caught his attention. His heart raced as he reached for it, brushing the dust off the cover. The name of the previous owner, Mark Reeves, was scrawled across the front in faded ink. David hesitated for only a moment before opening it, flipping through the pages. The entries were incoherent at first, ramblings of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. But the last entry stopped David cold. It was short, written hastily, as if the writer was terrified. The words burned into his mind as he read them aloud to himself. "I hear it breathing from inside the walls. It wants to be free." David slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. The silence in the room became oppressive, the air thickening again with an unnatural weight. He felt something terrible, watching him, waiting. And as he looked back at the wall behind him, the shadows seemed to move, as if they were alive. On the outskirts of town, hidden behind a veil of overgrown trees and thick fog, stood an old, decaying hospital. Its windows were shattered, the doors rusted, and the very air around it seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. For decades, it had sat abandoned, forgotten by most, but never truly empty. The stories surrounding the hospital were enough to keep most people far away. Tales of inhumane experiments, strange disappearances, and whispered cries that could be heard from the building late at night. Locals spoke of the place in hushed tones, warning anyone who dared get too close. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the souls of those who had been experimented on in the hospital's final days. Whatever the truth was, it had remained a mystery, locked away in the forgotten corners of history. Until now. Mark, A self-proclaimed paranormal investigator had heard the stories, and like so many before him, he dismissed them as nothing more than exaggerated rumors. Armed with only his equipment and a thirst for proof of the supernatural, he decided to spend one stormy evening inside the hospital, determined to capture evidence of whatever haunted the old walls. He'd investigated haunted houses, cursed objects, and even ancient graveyards. But there was something different about this place. There was a sense of finality here. Like the hospital's abandonment had been the end of something much darker than anyone had ever imagined. It was the kind of place that beckoned to the brave, or the foolish. As Mark stepped over the threshold, the door creaked shut behind him with an eerie finality. A chill ran down his spine. The building smelled of mildew, decay, and something else. Something metallic. The moment he crossed into the darkness, he felt an unsettling presence, a weight in the air as if he wasn't alone. His flashlight flickered for a second, and the shadows seemed to dance around him, stretching and twisting unnaturally. It was as if the hospital itself was aware of his presence, watching him. He ignored the rising sense of dread and pressed on. This was what he did. This was what he wanted. But the longer he stayed, the heavier the air became, until the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. As Mark ventured deeper into the darkened halls, the silence was oppressive. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust so thick it muffled his footsteps. His flashlight cast long, flickering beams across the walls, illuminating the remnants of the hospital's grim history. Old medical equipment was scattered in rooms, abandoned in a hurry. Faint cries echoed from somewhere deep in the building, distant, almost imperceptible, like the voices of patients long gone. Were they real? Or were they just echoes of the past? Mark's heart raced as he moved through the halls, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, their shapes constantly changing, but nothing was ever truly clear. There was no clear source for the sounds, just whispers, cries, movement just beyond his reach. In one of the rooms, Mark found a series of old medical records scattered across a desk. He picked them up carefully, his fingers brushing over the brittle pages. The papers were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. Most of the records detailed standard hospital procedures, treatments, diagnoses, notes on patients. But then, in the margins were strange annotations, mentions of unusual symptoms, abnormal growths, and behavioral irregularities. One record in particular stood out. It was an account of experiments conducted on patients who didn't even seem human. Creatures with distorted forms, grotesque features, and behavior that was anything but normal. The last entry in the file sent a shiver down his spine. Subject X has shown signs of violent aggression. Recommend termination of project. Do not allow escape. But the strangest part of the file was the inclusion of a photograph, an image of a patient with an inhuman, monstrous face. Mark's stomach twisted as he realized the creature in the picture was staring directly at the camera, its eyes filled with a horrifying intelligence. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the halls, rattling the walls. Mark jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound had come from a room down the hall. He turned, flashlight shaking in his hand, and made his way toward the noise. As he approached the door, he heard something else. A low growl, deep and guttural. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever heard before. The growl continued, growing louder with each step he took. Something was in that room, and whatever it was, it didn't want him to come closer. Mark hesitated, his hand on the door handle. Then he gripped it, pushed the door open, and the growl stopped abruptly. Inside the room, the air was thick with a cold, damp fog. His flashlight flickered, casting brief, jerky shadows that danced along the walls. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. An old woman, her hair unkempt, her face twisted in agony. She stood motionless, her eyes wide open but unseeing. She was dressed in the tattered remains of a hospital gown, her pale skin almost translucent in the weak light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, his instincts screaming for him to run, but his feet betrayed him. The woman's eyes locked on his, unblinking. A sound, faint at first, began to build in the room. It was a low, raspy whisper, barely audible, yet it seemed to reverberate in Mark's mind, crawling under his skin. She raised her hand slowly, a gnarled, trembling finger pointing directly at Mark. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to turn and flee, but he couldn't move. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that was not hers, low, raspy, and filled with an otherworldly dread, she whispered, "Get out before it comes back." The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as though the very building itself was reacting to her words. Mark's flashlight flickered one final time before plunging the room into absolute darkness. His breath quickened, his pulse racing, but the woman never moved. She just stood there, her finger still pointed at him as the silence enveloped the room like a suffocating blanket. Mark's heart raced as he heard a sound behind him. A rustling, low and crawling, like something was moving in the shadows, but when he turned, the room was empty. The woman gone, or so he thought. These are terrifying, true stories that will haunt you long after the night is over. But now, I have to ask you, which one kept you awake tonight? Did the cursed doll send chills down your spine, or was it the whispers in the forest that had you looking over your shoulder? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what scared you the most. If you thought these stories were chilling, then you're not going to want to miss what's coming next. Imagine an abandoned theme park, rides rusting in silence, laughter that still echoes long after the crowds disappeared, and the unexplained shadows that seem to move on their own. In our next video, we'll take you inside a place where even the bravest refuse to tread. Before you go, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a night of terror. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, give this video a like, it helps more than you know. And if you've ever had a paranormal experience of your own, share it in the comments. Your story might just be featured in one of our future videos.